Welcome to UCR School of Medicine, first off, and thank you all for being here, especially on a rainy day. My name is Dr. Monica Carson. I'm the chair of the Division of Biomedical Sciences, S. Sue Johnson Presidential Endowed Chair, and the director of the Center for Glial Neuronal Interactions. I have the great pleasure of greeting you this evening and introducing Dr. Deborah Dees, who will provide welcome remarks for tonight's lecture. Dr. Deborah Dees serves as Vice Chancellor for Health Sciences and the Mark and Pam Rubin Dean of the School of Medicine. Without further delay, let us please welcome Dr. Deborah Dees.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Thomas and Salma Haider Breakthrough Lecture. Each year, this lecture brings the best and the brightest researchers in the biomedical field to UCR School of Medicine and the Riverside community to present their research. And every year, I try to attend, and I always leave having learned something valuable. I'm thrilled to be here this evening, and I know without a doubt I'll leave again with valuable insights. I'd like to take a moment to recognize the planning committee who coordinated this event. Dr. Thomas and Haider and Ms. Salma Haider. Dr. Monica Carson, Chair of the Division of Biomedical Sciences, Professor of Biomedical Sciences, and the S. Sue Johnson Presidential Endowed Chair. Ms. Edna Johannes, Executive Director of Development, and Ms. Andrea Ortiz, Development Coordinator. I'd like to especially thank Dr. and Mrs. Haider for creating the Endowed Fund that supports this event. We're appreciative of their generosity and ongoing support for the School of Medicine. And they have been with the School of Medicine since its inception. I should say before its inception, because they were here with the UCR-UCLA Biomedical Thomas Haider Biomedical Science Program. We're pleased to have one of our very own faculty this evening, Dr. David Lowe, who will be giving the Thomas and Salma Haider Breakthrough Lecture. And Dr. Haider will be introducing Dr. Lowe. So again, I thank you all for being here, and I promise you, you will leave with great insights, and you will see all of the fantastic work that Dr. Lowe has done and continues to do, and the impact that he's had on the School of Medicine and the community at large. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Dr. Thomas Haider. Dr. Haider is a world-renowned spine surgeon, philanthropist, entrepreneur, and inventor. A driving force behind the creation of UCR School of Medicine, Dr. Haider established the Thomas Haider program at UC Riverside School of Medicine, which provides an avenue for academically prepared and mission-oriented students to enroll in UCR School of Medicine each year. This program stemmed from the earlier UCR-UCLA Thomas Haider program in biomedical sciences. Dr. Haider is a recipient of the UC Riverside Chancellor's Medal of Honor, the American Medical Association Pride in the Profession Award, and the Outstanding Medical Professional of the Year Award by the United States Congress. Dr. Haider developed and patented significant medical instrumentation that is used in spine surgery throughout the country. He's a founding member of the American College of Spine Surgery, and he and his wife, Salma, created and operated the Children's Spine Foundation, through which they provide free medical care to children at their clinic, the Haider Spine Center, as well as in hospitals abroad. Dr. Haider has authored numerous medical publications and was appointed by the governor of California to the Medical Board of California and later to the State Bar Board of Governors. He serves as an associate clinical professor at UCR School of Medicine, and he was previously a clinical faculty member at UCLA School of Medicine. Dr. Haider and Salma have endowed the Salma Haider Endowed Chair of the Thomas Haider Program, held by Dr. Danny Teraguchi, Executive Associate Dean for Student Affairs. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Haider, who will introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dees. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. David Lowe, our very own professor in biomedical sciences. I have known Dr. Lowe for a number of years. He is just exceptional. And I'm so excited to hear his lecture on Salton Sea, which is a very important topic, not just in Inland Empire, but all of California. Dr. Lowe is a distinguished professor of biomedical sciences in the School of Medicine at UCR. He earned his MD, PhD degree, as well as postdoc training at this small university called University of Pennsylvania. He's the recipient of research awards from the American Diabetes Association. He has received numerous awards from the NIH. He also serves on the California Air Resources Board. This is a board that actually relocated in Riverside. It's a very important board for what goes on in California. During his 45-year career, he published over 180 papers. He was awardee of the Grand Challenges in Global Health from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Lowe was the founding director of BREATHE, B-R-E-A-T-H-E. So that stands for an important area of research, and it focuses on the effect of air quality on health. He was also the director of UCR School of Medicine Center for Health Disparities Research. Dr. Lowe's current research focuses on Salton Sea, dust, and its health impact. He uses graphic narratives like comic books to share health information with communities, making science and healthcare easier to understand and more accessible for all. Dr. Lowe, thank you so much for agreeing to be our speaker, and we can't wait to hear about your research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Lowe.
All right, thank you so much. I'll grab this and we can. Well, thank you, Dr. Haider, for the introduction, for the invitation, and everything. And thank you all for attending. I hope to tell you a rousing, good story. A few comments to get started. One is that it was exciting to do this work. It started off in Coachella Valley and extended to the rest of the Salton Sea region. And I think what made it so exciting is that although we always try to do high impact research, the idea is that this is having impact in the communities that we serve as a medical school, so that it really embodies the mission of the School of Medicine, that we are here to improve the health of our communities, and hopefully this will be a pilot example of how we can serve that particular mission. Another point I want to make is that this was possible because it was a multi and interdisciplinary work with literally a cast of thousands, including community members, as well as people from most of the colleges on this campus. So that was also kind of an exciting thing, that if you come to a university, that universe of scholars can participate in a way that actually does serve the communities. The complexity of the work that we did also highlights another important issue, as I'll get to in this talk, is that it's a very serious health crisis in the Salton Sea region, but it also means that finding solutions is complex and will require the same kind of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary collaborations and a serious investment in that kind of work. Now, I am going to offer a few modest suggestions on how we may do that, but we'll see. Okay, to start off, again, an important thank you to Dr. Haider and Ms. Haider. They have, as we've already heard, been such dedicated as community leaders to really be the reason we are sitting here in the School of Medicine. It wouldn't have come to be without their really tireless efforts, as well as their continuing efforts with the Haider program, the Haider Scholars, and so on. Okay, one thing I have to do, this disclaimer, now we have to do this for all these things. I have no conflicts to disclose. I did help co-found a startup biotech, but we have no employees, no money, and no products. So I think I can get away with that. All right, so the main story I'm going to tell you is a story with comics. As you heard, I like the idea of graphic narratives being effective tools for communicating even the most complex biomedical information. Today, the story is that we started off hearing that in the Salton Sea region, there's an extraordinarily high incidence of childhood asthma. And the families who know better than the researchers said it's the Salton Sea, it's the dust being generated in the Salton Sea that is the cause. And what we discovered to basically help answer that call is that the inflammation that the dust causes is non-allergic, it's neutrophilic, and I'll explain why that matters as we go through the talk. A main source of that inflammation is endotoxin, or LPS, which I will explain later as well, which is being synthesized by the environmental halophilic salt-loving bacteria living in Salton Sea water. And that is an unusual set of conditions that promote the production and stability of that toxic dust. Moreover, we did some epidemiology studies in the community to discover that the highest levels of that toxic dust correlate with the highest incidence of asthma in those communities. And the scenario is that we suspect that what's happening is that the agriculture activity is leading to runoff that sustains, if you want to use that term, the levels of the Salton Sea, which drives the growth of these bacteria to produce this toxin, and that gets aerosolized and gets basically transported into those communities, and we're suffering the consequences now. As I said, it's been a cast of thousands. This is fairly complete, and we even have comic illustrations of many of the players, as well as a list of the funding agencies. So the story, as I said, is interdisciplinary. I mean, any term you want to use is interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, all of those kinds of terms, because we are talking about discoveries that required involvement at three different worlds: the community that's affected, the environment and ecosystem that we've studied, as well as the basic research lab. And the studies involve three different scales: regional, the entire Salton Basin area, as well as the ecology of that system that was directly impacted by human decisions, and down to the molecular level where we can explain mechanisms of inflammation and disease. Okay, the Salton Sea, I have been impressed that when I teach students on this campus, surprisingly, very few have not only even heard of the Salton Sea or even know where it is. Just for your reference, you can see on the map, it's a very short drive from campus or from Los Angeles or from Irvine or from San Diego. It's actually quite close. It is California's largest lake, and it sits in this depression. Now, the region there is a desert, arid environment because the Peninsula Range of Mountains captures all of the moisture from the Pacific Ocean and dumps it in Orange County, San Diego, that sort of thing. And so that's why it is an extremely dry climate in the Salton Basin. And that matters a lot to what we're going to talk about. There is a lot of activity, both in terms of the population, economic activity, agricultural activity, but although there is such proximity to major population centers, including Los Angeles and San Diego, what is going on at the Salton Sea is not exactly a picture of organized expansion of civilization into the wilderness. In fact, what we're seeing is a crisis that is entirely the consequence of human decisions and not necessarily in a good way, as we're going to see. The main focus of this talk is about the high incidence of asthma in communities that are there. And the communities are there for very specific reasons, which we'll also be discussing. So when I came to UCR, I had no suspicion I was going to be working on this. But what happened was it was brought to my attention, and Cheney and Conchita Pazar told me that the families in Coachella Valley had been suffering from a high incidence of asthma. And we hear almost every week another news article about, oh, the devastation at the Salton Sea, all these problems. I too now do a lot of media interviews on what's going on at the Salton Sea. The thing is that we are aware that the families are concerned about their children's health. We are aware of health effects in the region, and the consensus is that the Salton Sea is the source of all of these problems. Unfortunately, the media just keeps playing up this kind of like post-apocalyptic landscape and all of that, and doesn't really get past that. So what I'm hoping to do today is get you past that simple, like, oh my gosh, it's so bad. So from talking to the families, for example, Anne had published a paper recently from interviews with families, talking about the consequences and then there's the lived experiences and so on. And those discussions I had going out there visiting with them were really emotional, really traumatic because of the serious concerns they have. And because these communities are underserved, they feel nobody's hearing them, nobody's listening, and nobody's doing anything about them. Unfortunately, that is true. And hope is that from hearing this, you will like get your pitchforks and get out there and change what's happening. Part of what we've been doing is community engagement and dissemination. We partnered with California Air Resources Board to hold community forum events. We did live events and we have the videos posted in English and in Spanish. We have a website to communicate at the layman level short reports on a lot of the health and environmental issues in that region. And as we heard, we've also been publishing a series of comic books. So let's start at the beginning. Thousands of years ago, the Salton Sea Depression, as I said, it was an arid environment, and it's about 300 feet below sea level. So water goes in and it doesn't go out except by evaporation. Most of the time, over the thousands of years, it was a dry lake bed. And occasionally the Colorado River might overflow and the water would go in there, but then within a few years, that arid environment, it would dry up and it would be returned to being a dry salt flat. And over time, some of that had been actually used for harvesting salt for sale. During all of these many years, the indigenous tribes, there are many indigenous tribes that have lived in the region. Many of them have been moving in and around that region. When the lake fills up, they can benefit from the water and fish and wildlife and so on, but then it will dry up and then they may wander off to the coast where they can get seafood and things like that. But in 1905, some so-called enterprising businessmen decided that because the alluvial soil from the Colorado was fertile and all it needed was water, so they built a canal from the Colorado River. And because California has what's called senior rights, they were able to get this canal. However, at the time, they didn't have the engineering to make sure that it was in good shape. So the canal failed, and over the next 2 years, it just filled up the basin. And that created what is now the present-day Salton Sea. It was, over that period, a freshwater lake and a resort area. It was stocked with game fish. And in its heyday, especially in the 50s, you had all the Hollywood celebrities, the Rat Pack, building resorts, and there was a huge real estate boom. And you can see a whole lot of postcards from that era showing things like automobile racing, you know, water skiing, all those kinds of resort type activities. However, in the 70s, what happened was a series of storms and hurricanes devastated the region because as a terminal lake, water goes in, doesn't go out. That means that it was susceptible to overflows and flooded the surrounding communities. And that ended up devastating the economic vitality of that region. And because you have no control of the lake levels, we now have the opposite problem where now the lake is continuing to shrink instead of flood. Now, that means that since the 70s, all of the health crisis we're seeing is relatively recent, literally within living memory of the people who are living in that region. So how does it look now, and where is this going? The only thing maintaining the lake, because it would have dried up, is the fact that because of the irrigation from the Colorado, the agriculture activity has designated the Salton Sea not as a naturally occurring lake, which would be protected under federal law. It is instead designated as an agricultural sump. Translation is open sewer, which means that the agriculture industry has no regulations to govern what they dump into the Salton Sea. So all of the excess irrigation water that leaches out minerals from the soil, pesticides, fertilizer, all of that is dumped into the Salton Sea. And so it is not enough to maintain the level. So as it dries, it also exposes more of the lake bed where a lot of the dust is generated. Okay, so now, having all that history, we now wanted to address this concern in the families. What's going on? So in the Breathe Lab, we, with David Cocker and CSERT, we basically developed a system for doing environmental chamber exposures. So we could take various kinds of defined aerosols and do continuous long-term exposures to animal models and look what the health effects are. So this is a diagram here of, and the pictures on the right actually are the chambers that are in my lab right now. And so we were able to do these exposure studies. And so you can see here on the right, we can very carefully control the size of the aerosol particles as well as the mass concentration, meaning that we could do aerosols that we know exactly what's in the aerosol. And because we can control the size, we can make sure that they get deep into the lungs of the mice breathing it. The mice basically live in this chamber for a week or up to 4 weeks. And so they basically don't have any other kind of manipulation, so they just breathe naturally. So it's mimicking the natural exposure of people who might be living out in that region exposed to the aerosols. Now, to validate the ability of that chamber to mimic the aerosol exposure, what we can do is, in this case, we took fluorescent particles, did the same kind of the same kind of aerosol exposure, and we can see all those little red dots. Those are showing that the aerosol particles are getting deep into all of the lung spaces in those mice. And that really says that we can, if we see a health effect or an inflammatory effect, things like that, it would involve the entire lung. The reason I put it that way is that many animal models will do things like put a drop on the mouse's nose or, various kinds of approaches that don't mimic the natural process of breathing and exposure. So now that we have this kind of system, we can ask the question, what are the health impacts? Well, if the issue is the high incidence of asthma in children in the Salton Sea region, what would that look like? The classical clinical definition of asthma says that you have wheezing, coughing, shortness of breath, and so on. However, it's associated with inflammation, but doesn't require a specific type of inflammation. So now all of you are going to learn some immunology. There won't be a quiz after this, but you're going to get it. That is important because the underlying cause of the inflammation is not as critical to the clinical diagnosis. However, in this story, it matters, everything matters because of the cause of the inflammatory response. So there are a couple types of inflammation, and we're going to talk about that. But the other thing is that because we are talking about asthma in the Salton Sea region, we know there's asthma all across the country, around the world. Something unique about the Salton Sea, the high incidence, must be a local cause. So part of solving the puzzle is answering the question is what is unique about the Salton Sea giving rise to an inflammatory response and the clinical symptoms? So what is that? Is there a unique toxin, allergen, something like that that is only present at the Salton Sea and not present at, say, Palm Springs, which is not so far away? So what we did was we went out there with my lab as well as Emma Aronson's lab in plant pathology. No, I guess they're called microbiology now. But so we had dust collectors and water collection all around the region. You can see that around the Salton Sea, those sites were where you have the highest incidence of asthma, and then also sites further away, Boyd Deep Canyon, Palm Desert, where you don't see the incidence of asthma, but it's still in the arid, dusty environment as well. So we can look at those samples and see what the health effects are. And this is just a picture showing, you'll be, interested to see that our passive dust collectors are basically bunt pans, with marbles. And then we rinse them out and then we have our dust, right? We actually had to fabricate a skimmer because when we put this stuff out there on the water to gather water samples from the surface layer of the water. And that's Trevor there not falling in. And there's a picture of the lab all in their masks because I now no longer allow anybody to go out there without a mask. You'll see why. So what do? We do the exposures. And then we collect samples. We look at cells that have accumulated in the airways. We look at tissues for histology, and then we also look at patterns of gene expression. And the idea is that the pattern of the response in the tissue will give us clues to what the initiating or aggravating factors are in the aerosols. So our initial thought was, because we're talking about asthma, clinically, most people assume that it has to do with atopic asthma or allergic responses. So does that mean we are going to find the Salton Sea allergen. And then for the beginning of these studies, that's what we thought we were going to see. Why does that matter? Well, I recently gave a talk to a room full of allergists and residents, and I had to explain this to them because they had already forgotten it. So don't worry if, no matter how many degrees you have, I'm going to teach you this again. Innate immunity is part of the immune system that is basically a rapidly initiated response to microbial molecules. The first responder effect from innate immunity is neutrophil recruitment. The other kind of immunity is called adaptive immunity, and that's where it involves things like antibodies, T lymphocytes, B lymphocytes, all of those sorts of things. And those are the cells in the adaptive immune system that give rise to allergic responses. So the allergic responses that people often associate with asthma are part of the adaptive immune system. And part of the hallmarks are patterns of gene expression from the allergic gene expression, as well as recruitment of inflammatory cells, specifically eosinophils. And so those would be the signs we're looking for if we have evidence for an allergic asthma in these residents of the Salton Sea region. And as I said, clinicians generally assume that when they see asthma, they are assuming that the kid may have a skin test positive, and therefore they must have allergic or atopic asthma, so they give them an inhaler and tell them to go away. They don't do all the spirometry testing and things like that. However, I think that recent studies suggest that picture is changing. And in this case, it matters quite a lot. So, Salton Sea, what is it doing? So here's one study we did where we looked at the effect of Salton Sea water. These dots on the screen show gene expression patterns. So the details aren't important, but the patterns of gene expression mean that animals showing a characteristic response will cluster together. And so you'll see that in the control group, in the green dots on the left, they all tend to cluster together. If we do exposure to Salton Sea water instead, they also cluster, but they cluster separately from the control. So it means that Salton Sea water does do something. What exactly we'll get to. If it were allergic, what would we compare it to? So on the right, you see the red dots, which is Alternaria. That's a common fungus. All of you have it in your fridge. You know, it's a tomato fungus, all right? And it's a very potent allergen. When we expose mice to Alternaria, we see a very impressive allergic response, but you can see that it's quite distinct from the pattern of gene expression from Salton Sea exposures. But also, the Salton Sea is also different from Pacific Ocean water exposures. So Salton Sea is a unique type of characteristic response and is not allergic, but it is also not normal. Moving on to dust exposures with these chambers, we were at first quite excited but disappointed that an exposure to dust from Salton Sea gave a very impressive inflammatory response. So you can see on the upper right, the neutrophil response is quite impressive. It was exciting, except if you look in the lower left, there were no eosinophils, no eosinophils. So it was not allergic. It was inflammatory, but not allergic. And so we had histological pictures suggesting we see the inflammation, we see this. We also have some gene expression patterns. So as I said, we were excited that we got an inflammatory response so easily, but we were disappointed that I was not going to discover the Salton Sea allergen. But it also was secretly alarmed because it didn't take that much to get a lung inflammatory response, which is why I require my students to wear masks when they go out there now, because this is scary. Now the pattern, as I said, the pattern of the response should help give you clues to what's triggering the response. So when we look more closely at this, we see on the right of each of these boxes that the Alternaria response gives you both a neutrophil response after 7 days and quite impressive eosinophil response after 7 days. And even if you look at the neutrophil response, the recruitment of cells goes up from 48 hours to 7 days. When we use Salton Sea dust, we did not see that pattern at all. It's completely different. We saw an initial strong inflammatory response of neutrophils, which actually seemed to decrease by 7 days. It's not completely gone, but it's still a little bit of a response. But as I said, no eosinophils. So what in the world is this? So as I said, remember the immunology slide. Innate immunity is an initial rapid first responder response to microbial components. It also resolves relatively quickly. We already showed you that we didn't see the evidence for adaptive immunity or allergic responses. So now we're back to the idea, it's like, what in the world, innate immunity? We're even seeing this evidence for a recovery between 48 hours and 7 days. So the character of the response gives us some clues. So if the response was innate immunity, then we could try to mimic it using well-known off-the-shelf innate immune triggers like other bacterial components like LPS or cell wall components, LTA. And in fact, we saw a similar pattern, that if we use the exposures, 48-hour versus 7 days, that we see an initial strong response both to LPS and to LTA that declines by 7 days. So it's suspiciously mimicking the innate immune response and not the allergic or adaptive immunity. To narrow it down even further, we used studies on a series of genetically engineered mice. Now here's where it gets technical. Our body's response to bacterial components relies on specific receptors. So our response to LPS depends on a receptor called TLR4. Our response to gram-positive bacterial cell wall is dependent on a receptor called TLR2. So we took engineered mice that lacked either TLR4 or TLR2 and asked whether they responded to Salton Sea dust. What we find is that the TLR4 knockout mice were the ones that were basically insensitive to Salton Sea dust, meaning that TLR4 is the receptor and therefore endotoxin or LPS is the Salton Sea toxin and not gram-positive bacteria components. Well, where in the world is this LPS coming from? We know that, for example, if you're familiar out at Imperial Beach, there's raw sewage being dumped in the Tijuana River and it's going into the ocean and they're getting aerosolized LPS, but it's basically raw sewage at the Mexican border. But we don't have that happening at the Salton Sea. So where is it coming from? And why does it matter? So the thing is, LPS is not just associated with clinical pathogens like E. coli or anything like that. It's just a component of gram-negative bacteria. And our body's response to this is basically, I call it a Chicken Little response, that there's a panic, overwhelming, excessive response because it's panicked into thinking it's being infected by something like E. coli. And so LPS by itself is not intrinsically chemically toxic. It's just the thing that triggers this panic alarm response. The source of the LPS then may not actually matter. So we ask that question, where is this LPS coming from? Is it raw sewage from human waste? Is it from feedlots and things like that? We don't have evidence for that at the Salton Sea. We also can rule out things like clinical pneumonia. It's not like some bacteria in the dust is causing an infection because we don't see evidence for clinical signs like fever. Of course, you know that in the Salton Sea, in the desert area, you have other kinds of pathogens like coccidioidomycosis that can cause lung infections, but we don't see any evidence that that's what's going on. So here's a clue. When we were measuring LPS levels in the dust, we used two different assays. One is relying on a horseshoe crab limulus assay. It's not important, but we could detect levels of LPS, significant levels of LPS. Another assay we used was a commercial kit using antibodies, and we didn't detect anything. So we contacted the company to find out, well, what's up with that? And they said, our kit can only detect clinical LPS from like E. coli. It will not detect environmental bacteria LPS. So, so that means that what we must be seeing is that the dust is we're measuring LPS in the dust coming from environmental bacteria. Kind of a scary thought. So let's put this in a little bit of historical context. As you know, we are all true believers in the germ theory of disease. I'm going to shake it up a bit because way back in Victorian England, there was the precursor was the miasma theory of disease. And that was basically generated because in and around London, you had decaying organic material from the swamps and it was smelly. You had, in those days, they didn't have municipal sanitation, so people dumped sewage into the basement of their buildings. If you ever read that book about cholera. So they didn't realize that the cholera was caused by a bacteria, so they're just blaming on the smelly vapor. So that was the miasma theory of disease. And then modern scientists, all of the sophisticates, now believe in the germ theory of disease, that a disease is caused by a specific bacteria or virus or something like that. So I am going to revive the miasma monster. So our proposal is that the disease we're seeing is not from infection or colonization by these environmental bacteria, but instead by dust containing those bacterial components, leading to chronic persistent exposure and chronic persistent inflammation. And that is that miasma being generated at the Salton Sea causing those symptoms. And so how do we mimic or recreate those conditions? So my students went out there and got samples of water, and we got all these bacterial isolates and cultured them in the lab. They are adapted to the high salt. And you can see on the graph here in the middle that Salton Sea is now rapidly increasing in salinity. It's well past twice the Pacific Ocean salinity. These bacteria are incredibly well adapted to that high salinity. In fact, they don't grow well either higher or lower salt. So they're really quite well adapted. Now, we can grow those and we can extract LPS from those gram-negative bacteria. And you can see on the right with the arrow, it's incredibly potent as an inflammatory toxin. So even though these are environmental bacteria, they're exquisitely halophilic, salt tolerant, and incapable of colonizing human lungs, they still produce a very potent inflammatory toxin. So we have a way of, mimicking those conditions. We've also done electron microscopy of those bacteria. And at least this one isolate was interesting because we actually see them budding off little bits of the membrane of the bacteria. These are known as outer membrane vesicles, and it's an active shedding of membrane. In this case, the outer membrane vesicles are mostly LPS. So we have estimates that a significant proportion of the LPS in those cultures is from these outer membrane vesicles. Well, that's not good news. Let's make it worse. So it turns out that engineers and biochemists have these terms cosmotropic and chaotropic ions and things like that. I learned a lot in these years. So cosmotropic ions like calcium and magnesium help stabilize structures, including things like micelles formed from amphipathic molecules like LPS, where there's a lipid component and a carbohydrate component. And calcium and magnesium are really good at stabilizing those micelles, which means that if we're shedding these things into Salton Sea water, they are stabilized by the high calcium magnesium in Salton Sea water. So that means that they can more easily get into the air as stabilized particles, either from sea spray or from playa dust. So I'm sure that makes you feel even better. So does that mean the ecosystem is out to get us? By the way, this poster is from a movie from 1958 filmed at the Salton Sea. you know, the San Andreas Fault, there's an earthquake, this mollusk comes out of the water, starts killing Navy seamen and beachgoers and things like that. It's a crazy, really, really bad movie. But it was filmed at the Salton Sea. That's why I have a poster in my office. Okay. Anyway, so there is no monster out to get us. It is the consequence of other things leading to the growth of those bacteria, production of the LPS, aerosolization, and then breathing it in those communities. And that's because it doesn't require the LPS to come from an actual clinical pathogen. Almost any LPS will do. Okay, so back to the community. So now what we did was, in collaboration with HARC, who's been partnering with us on a lot of projects, we did a community level epidemiology study. So we got 830 responses from families all across the Salton Sea region. And you can see those green dots around the map show where all of our responses came from. So both Coachella Valley all the way down into deep into Imperial Valley, we got the family responses. So we asked about a variety of symptoms. The things that families were concerned about were not just asthma and wheezing, but also things like skin rash, nosebleeds, things like that. So these are all part of the same study. What we saw is that in order to get an idea of the incidence, we actually clustered the responses into little population aggregates here. So you can see these little maps with these little areas. And so we can estimate the percentage of the symptoms in these different communities. And what we see is that it's bad enough in Coachella Valley, where it's already triple the incidence of asthma in the rest of California. So that's bad enough. But when you go down into Imperial Valley, you can see this gradient where it's actually double. So it's really, really bad if you're living in Imperial Valley. That the percentage of families, not individuals, the percentage of families with asthma symptoms is approaching 40%. So whenever I've gone out there, every time I meet people, like they either have asthma, have kids with asthma, you know, it's bad. To give it a little bit of analysis, we did work with the Geospatial Sciences Center here on campus and did correlations with using Salton Sea as a point origin and mapping correlations with all the cases of asthma in the whole region. And because the prevailing winds basically go from northwest to southeast, we see a very high degree of correlation between the wind direction, the particle concentrations, the PM10 levels, and the incidence of asthma in those targeted communities. And it seems to roughly match the levels of LPS that we measured in dust from those areas as well. So it's very suspicious that all those things are coming together. Here's another aggregating factor. So as I mentioned, all that agriculture activity, in part, that's why so many people live there, because we have immigrants from Mexico coming to work in the fields. The runoff at the southern end of the Salton Sea, in the red box you see shows nutrient flux. At the southern end of the Salton Sea, the nutrient flux is 10 times higher than it is at the northern end. And that's measured by concentrations of nitrate and phosphate, as well as the actual amount of water runoff. So the theory is that what's happening is that all that fertilizer is driving the growth of the microbial ecosystem in that water. As it grows, it uses up the oxygen. So it also means that those bacteria this process called eutrophication uses up the oxygen. So those bacteria die and release their components, including cell wall and LPS. So again, not good. But it's driven in part by this excess nutrient burden provided from the agriculture activity. So to summarize where we are, the idea is that we have evidence that the dust is in fact responsible for an inflammatory response in the lungs, and that it's dependent on LPS from the halophilic bacteria growing in Salton Sea water. And it matches the evidence for the LPS matches the epidemiology in the communities where prevailing wind patterns as well as community concentrations match this. So how do we get here? As I mentioned, this is happening within living memory. Okay, 1970s, but I'm really old, so that's even within my living memory. What happened? So in that period, as I showed you on the one graph, the salinity rapidly increased, and it's even getting steeper. I suspect that the salinity helps drive we know that bacteria adapt to salinity by changing their synthesis of LPS. So that may be another aggregating factor. The eutrophication from the overgrowth from the nutrient burden. And as the lake continues to retreat, more of the playa is exposed and more of the dust is being produced. So this is a toxic ecology, and it's entirely the consequence of human decisions. We didn't let the lake dry up. We continue to feed it with agriculture runoff. And there are no laws regulating the stewardship of that body of water because it's considered an open sewer, not a natural lake. All right? So for those of you who generally hang out in the lab, here's a term to learn: neoliberalism. Okay, this is a consequence of basically laissez-faire capitalism, absence of regulation, the idea being that government isn't necessary and that the market will fix things. That's not what's happening here. So the idea is that, in fact, it's worse because Colorado River water, because of the senior rights that California has, it's a free natural resource. And so the irrigation districts are just profiting off of distributing that water. And so that's why recently they made an agreement to sell a lot of that water to San Diego, so San Diego can grow more suburbs. Meanwhile, all the waste products are going into Salton Sea, driving this whole nasty process. So who knew there would be consequences? So what are we doing? And I don't mean we, I mean, what are they doing, right? So the agencies and offices, a laundry list of all these agencies that are responsible theoretically to address the health concerns of those communities. And what are they doing? Well, we know that they started a project to build perimeter lakes because we know that we really care about the bird watching community, which is overwhelmingly white guys. Yeah, there's migratory birds. Yeah, okay. But what else is going on? So people are coming up with all kinds of suggestions. And I would suggest that there's a little bit of chaos in this because there are a lot of suggestions. Oh, let's just pour more water in there. But we don't have an idea of what kind of solution will actually address the health needs or the change in the ecosystem that could have these health effects. What's worse is that pumping water into the Salton Sea is even less likely because, as you know, on this diagram here, the Colorado River is also drying up and there are no other sources of water. There's no rain, well, except for today, but there's no rain, there's no other sources of water. And you can see from this diagram that Lake Mead, which is fed by Colorado River water, is already at the historically low levels ever. So it's not like that's going to be the answer either. Meanwhile, state agencies are doing things like this. We have the perimeter lakes because we really care about our bird watchers, but they also do these projects, one of which is to put thousands of hay bales on the playa, in theory to reduce dust production. There's another project where they dig deep furrows in the playa, again, to try to change the wind patterns and again, to try to reduce dust production. None of these change what's in the dust. And meanwhile, there are no funds dedicated to actually studying the health effects. So if all of these projects are in theory intended to improve health in the communities, why aren't we studying the communities? Good question. I asked it, you can answer it, right? This is not unique to Salton Sea. Aerosolized LPS is a problem not fully recognized, but it's a problem all over the world. More prominent examples, I've been to Salt Lake City. They have a problem as well with the drying Great Salt Lake. And the aerosols there and the higher incidence of asthma, guess what? It's in the communities right next to the Great Salt Lake. But Utah's different. They don't have air quality monitoring. They don't want to know. Also in Central Valley, we have issues like organic dust toxic syndrome. That is largely an aerosolized LPS problem too, although in this case, admittedly, it is cow poop. The feedlots, if you've ever driven past it, wear a mask, We also have this issue, as I mentioned, Imperial Beach and so on. So what's unique and what allowed us to discover this is that what's different of the Salton Sea is not just the abundant source of this aerosolized LPS, but the magnitude of the health impacts in this community. And that actually, for good or bad, helped us solve this puzzle. So what can we do now? I don't know. But what we are trying to do is, as I showed earlier, with engagement, we are trying to communicate what we know to communities and anybody else who would listen. Another thing we're trying to do is ask the question is that if this is a non-allergic asthma, it's non-atopic, then it must have unique clinical features. It does not have an ICD code, for example. Non-allergic asthma does not have an ICD code. Our hope is that we define a clinical entity that's sufficiently detailed and specific that it does become a distinct diagnosis, especially because of the common occurrence of aerosolized LPS. We don't know the answers to that. We're trying to do studies to ask that question. If we have better information on the actual clinical spectrum and features, then we might actually come up with ideas on how we can not just diagnose it better, but also treat it more effectively. And that is hopefully the next steps that we're going to go toward. Thanks for laughing at all the jokes. And thanks for all your questions. Here's a couple of websites if you're interested. But anyway, thanks to you all for coming. I'll take any questions.
Thank you, David, for giving us such a great, fascinating talk. And, a lot of us scientists always strive to try to take it bench to bedside, but you almost taken it from bedside to bench all the way back to bedside. So really great talk. We're going to take some questions now for David. Can I see any? I see Emma Wilson back there raised her hand, really shot up fast. Should we get the mic to you? We'll do the mic.
Very much. That was a great talk. Thank you, David. It was a great talk. I liked the immunology part, and you did a great job of explaining the difference between the innate and the adaptive. But of course, innate often leads to adaptive. So several questions about that. Have you ever come across people that have moved away from the area? Because that has very important long-term effects for communities and potentially
So in
others.
Conversations with the families, many of them don't have health insurance, right? So they will go visit their families in Mexico because they can get cheap inhalers without a diagnosis. So they're self-medicating. But they tell me they go to Mexico with the families and the kids no longer have symptoms. When they drive north, when you pass Cathedral City, the kids no longer have symptoms. That actually is suspiciously familiar if we're thinking in terms of innate immunity, right? Because the resolution might be rapid. However, the other answer is that I have a student in the lab who's asking about persistent exposure. Does that have lasting effects? I'm not going to get into that.
David, so what can the residents of the area do now to improve their own health? Are there programs for installing air filters in houses? Would they be effective?
Well, there are and I keep forgetting the name, but you basically buy a pack of air filters and you use duct tape and a box fan, right? And so indoor dust levels can be brought way down. Only problem is if you have to go to work, go to school, buy groceries, you still have to go outside. And but basically the indoor, the course, what is that called? Anyway, but you have to have it on pretty much all the time because many of these people live in unlicensed trailer parks. So they're not really well sealed from the environment. So anything going on outside is also happening inside. So yes, that's great. And of course, you know, we've had like anecdotal evidence that during the pandemic, all the kids were wearing masks and their symptoms were reduced, but we have no quantitative actual facts on that. But kids are not going to wear masks day and night. You can't have, you know, the filter is not a complete solution and we're not addressing the source problem. So that's why the other part of the question is like, what can we do? Can we address the source? And that is a big, interesting puzzle. But we got to actually know that that's a problem that needs to be solved instead of digging furrows and putting hay bales. In fact, once an engineer called me up because people were complaining that the hay bales were producing a lot of dust that was irritating people's lungs. I said, well, duh. Sorry.
No worries. Other questions? No. Well, we'll go here first and then we'll get to you.
David, so the issue is LPS, is that correct?
Yes, in the context of the larger alteration of the ecosystem.
Okay, but even in your statement, you said that you go to Mexico, or if you go above what, Coachella?
Cathedral
So
City.
it seems as if at this point it's localized. Is that correct?
That's right. So we almost don't hear much of concern at all in Palm Springs.
And that's where I'm going. So it's within a distinct socioeconomic setting, correct?
Well, see, that's the puzzle because it's not just being rich and white that protects you. It's the wind direction.
So would those folks outside of that envelope ever be impacted by this LPS?
As more of the dust gets produced at the Salton Sea, then the reach of the dust may be greater. I mean, we can hope, but we don't really want to hope for that.
Well, but going south into Imperial County remains in that socioeconomic grouping. That's going north into the Coachella Valley gets into a higher. So will it ever get into that higher income?
Well, I'll give you an example. I've always had undergrads who go to the Coachella Music Festival and they always come back coughing and wheezing. And I said, just give me a piece of your lung so I can look at it.
Yeah. And
so there's your other socioeconomic category.
Because it is, I mean, originally it was proposed that the dust would, in essence, go into the greater Coachella Valley into the higher income communities, and that would trigger a political response, which at this point is there, but it's not as dramatic as you want it to be.
Right. And part of the problem is that most of the prevailing wind goes south. There are seasonal shifts, all right? So during like late summer and so on, it may shift a little bit north, but it's not quite enough for them to start raising an alarm.
Okay, and then one other quick question. The bacteria you said live within a certain salinity level?
Right. It gets really interesting because it's continuing to change. And the question is, what is that adaptation doing to the bacteria in the LPS?
The salinity is more than twice
more than twice specific. Now, Mono Lake and Salt Lake, Great Salt Lake are even far saltier than that too.
So that is the question. If the salinity gets to a certain point, will the bacteria basically just die out in the LPS too?
Okay, life finds a way. They will adapt. Because as long as there's food, right? If we told the community to stop dumping fertilizer into the Salton Sea, that might change it altogether.
Hi, we'll go to Jenny.
Fascinating talk, David. You mentioned that like they also dump a bunch of the pesticides, toxins into the Salton Sea. Have you, like other people, look at the toxins carried by the dust do they carry those chemicals? Do those chemicals actually, can they make the LPS, effect worse? Well, if you have those kind of combination effects.
So there are two categories of pesticides to worry about. So one is basically DDT, which never goes away. However, it's mostly stuck in the sediments. And because theoretically they've stopped using it, there isn't a continued contribution. The other pesticides are rapidly degraded in the environment. So we don't know. However, in the literature at least, we don't have evidence that either those pesticides cause lung inflammation. So we were trying to focus on things that match the clinical symptoms.
So moving things a little bit a different direction, talking about wind directions. What have been some of the outcomes or results of the comic book, of the community education, the community involvement on these issues?
The main outcome is we've gone through a couple of printings because they keep asking for more. I'm hoping because of the quality, the kids get it read to them every night. They want to be a scientist when they grow up. But I mean, we can't measure that. That is a good question. I mean, just the fact that there's demand means we gotta do more of that. I think we haven't sufficiently saturated the market, I guess, is the way to put it. We haven't gotten enough of them out there.
I'm going to sneak one question in myself. So now, so many diseases, we search so long and are treating the symptoms and not really the cause. And now that you've kind of pioneered that path to get us to what the cause is, how do you think that's going to influence the treatment? As you mentioned, they've been treating for asthma. It's not really asthma. Is there other treatments like, COPD and other things that might be more appropriate for those patients in those areas, you think?
So that's a really interesting topic. So generally, the approaches are bronchodilation to improve airway function, and the other is anti-inflammatory, like inhaled corticosteroids. We're describing something that may not be addressed by either of those pharmacologic approaches. And so if we're going to approach this from the point of view of blocking the effect of LPS, that may have not just a different therapeutic target, but also different kind of therapeutic benefit. That's an interesting question.
Another question back here.
I guess on the topic of inflammation, I'm curious if inflammatory medications like prednisone would be a potential.
If our main inflammatory response is neutrophils, corticosteroids may have some benefit, but in allergic disease, the corticosteroids are really addressing the lymphocyte response. So it may have a more effective, therapeutic benefit there. If what we're seeing there is not related to lymphocyte activity, then the limited effect of corticosteroids on neutrophil responses may not be a sufficient answer. I don't have any better answer than that.
So you talked about LPS, but it's not a specific molecule. It's a very broad class of molecules. So you mentioned that almost any LPS will do. How much it's any, or are there any LPSs which would not do?
Ooh. We've had a couple of conversations. So any particular bacterial species makes a variety of different LPS molecules because of the glycosylation and things like that. Not all bacterial LPS is equally potent as a trigger for TLR4. And so the fact that we have a half a dozen different microbial isolates, all of which make an inflammatory LPS, is interesting. So it means that we can't just target one species. So it's basically a whole lot of stuff happening there. But it makes it more complicated if we're going to try and target that. But yes, the variation in potency of the LPS is interesting, but it may be more of an intellectual issue, not a therapeutic one.
See a question up here at the front.
Hello? Do you think it's appropriate for future research to see, because if LPS is what causes the inflammation, you think it's appropriate to see how to prevent LPS from being released from the membrane in the bacteria?
When I've given this talk, I've had people say, well, why don't we just dump a lot of antibiotics into the Salton Sea? Which might be an approach. And I said, well, I'm sure there will be no unintended consequences. So that is a really tricky question. So is our target the patient or is our target the ecosystem? Because you're asking, like, can we change the biology of the ecology to change what's being produced? I think that's a huge problem. And like I said, I'm sure nothing would go wrong, right?
Well,
If you believe that it's a huge problem, then what's the answer to that problem? If we're talking about LPS as a huge problem, part of it is just letting people know and understand that's what the target should be. Because, you know, we're probably, right now, we're the only lab studying the mechanism of disease in that region. If we point out that, oh, you know, it's happening in Mono Lake, it's happening in Great Salt Lake, it's happening at Aral Sea, it's happening at Caspian Sea, then it may matter to more people. And so part of the goal is to get more people to think about it and also participate in doing research wherever they are and whatever they're doing. That would be at least one approach.
Hi, Dr. Lowe. Thank you again for always an enjoyable talk. This might be super, super simple, but I'm curious to know how much livestock in the area is being consumed by the community and how that could also possibly be affecting them. Or I don't know if you looked at the gut at all.
There are feedlots in Imperial Valley. But it doesn't look like it's making a major contribution to LPS that we can detect in Salton Sea water. So it's probably there, but it may be a minor contributor.
okay, any other questions out there for Dr. Lowe? Oh,
With all the runoff toxins with phosphates, nitrates, nitrites, are you seeing other carcinogenic effects where older individual who's been exposed for a long period are now having various forms of cancer?
In Imperial Valley, there are people concerned about rates of lung cancer. Problem being that there isn't sufficient data to know whether or not it's a significant increase. So part of it is that we need to actually do the clinical epidemiology to know if it's there, because it could be there. That is definitely a concern, but without the data, we don't know where to go.
oh, we got one more there.
Does there exist any LPS inhibitor medication already that may help the existing patients with the asthma that you indicated?
That's why we started a company. Yes, that's all I can say.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I'm willing to take investors.
That's UCR intellectual property, right?
Yeah, they'll license it too.
Hello. I'm sorry, I came in a little late, but I was wondering if there was like any way students could help get involved. I see the comic book right there. Can we help volunteer to make like resources to help inform the community or make a difference over there?
Yes, I have a lot of people in the lab who are helping. We have people who are working on our website. We have students who are working on comics. There's a lot of different ways where people can participate.
Is like there more information on how to access or those resources so that we can apply and help?
You know, send me an email, we can talk.
Thank you.
Okay, it looks like we got all the questions. Thank Dr. Lowell. Now I'll hand it back over to Dr. Carson to round us out for the evening.
That was fabulous. Thank you, Scott, for doing such a great job. And this was just everybody's engagement is outstanding. Right now, I would like to call up Dr. Haider. Yes, you have to stay here too. And I turn this over to Dr. Haider.
Thank you. What a true biomedical breakthrough lecture. It's such an important topic, and it just opens our eyes to this new thing, the LPS, that I really didn't know much about, and I don't know, most people probably didn't. But we always give a gift to our speakers that kind of matches the lecture. And before I do this, I just want to say thank you again to Dr. Dees and Dr. Monica Carson, Edna and Andrea. They have been very instrumental in getting everything organized and arranged, and we really appreciate all your help. And so, Dr. Lowe, we have a crystal for here for you that's in the shape of a wave. And it has your name with your lecture, today's date, and you can put it in your office or at home, either one. But I just want you to know that we really appreciate all your help. You have been a very active member in this lectureship that we have done over the years. And thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call up Dean Dees.
Okay, thank you. On behalf of UCR School of Medicine, I'd like to present this certificate to Dr. David Lowe, Haider Biomedical Sciences Breakthrough Lecture, October 9th, 2025. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
And with that, I'd like to thank everyone here for such attention, engagement. I'd like to thank the Dr. and Mrs. Haider for just their long-term support and for facilitating this specific event, which has really, as a breakthrough lecture, has really just been a seminal event for us year in and year out. And wait till next year's. You're going to want to hear that one next. And we'd like to thank Dr. Lowe for his outstanding presentation, and go out there and have a wonderful evening and don't breathe.